Grammar. Nothing gets the YouTube clicks like it. Even better are verb tenses. Why do translations not agree on if things should be past, present, or future? Surely with a language as studied for so many years as Hebrew, we know all there is to know about how it works. Right? Buckle up. This is going to be a complicated one. Hi, I'm Gilgamesh, and this is a channel where we explore the Hebrew Bible and the beauty of its language. If you're into that sort of thing, hit the like and subscribe buttons so that you can see more of this kind of content. There aren't that many of us out there. Today we're going to tackle a detective story thousands of years in the making. If you've watched my previous videos, you may have heard me reference how complicated tense is in Hebrew and how it deserves its own video. This is that video. Now, I'm going to try and make this video useful to both Hebrew students and people with a more casual interest in the Bible. But to put all this together, we're going to need to discuss a lot of context about what we know, how we know it, and what we lost along the way. Translations often disagree, and the most common place that they disagree is on the tense of the verbs. Here are just a few random examples that I picked out rather quickly. There are endless more examples. Here's the secret of biblical Hebrew. No one actually knows, at least not with 100% certainty, how the Hebrew verbs work. We have theories, we have systems, but a great deal of uncertainty remains, and ideas have been changing over the last century. Tense isn't critical to understanding the meaning of a passage, so I don't want to overstate the nature of the problem here. But if you have an interest in the Bible or Hebrew, you probably want to understand this better. To help us untangle this mess, we're going to look at information that comes primarily from two scholars here, John Cook and Mark S. Smith, who have done some of the best explanations I've seen on the modern understanding of tense in the language. I'll provide full citations to their papers down in the comments below. To understand why we are confused today, we have to understand a little of how we got our text. Imagine Alphabet 1.0. Ancient Hebrew was written in what's called an abjad, a writing system that only has consonants. Now, the alphabet was a world-changing innovation. It was actually created, we now believe, by Canaanite slaves in the copper mines of Sinai.
In the copper mines of Geber, the living are dead.
It was then adopted rapidly by other Canaanites like the Phoenicians and many other cultures. But we could hardly expect the first of its kind to be perfect. In fact, I recently ran across a video by an Israeli doing a comedy skit about how crazy Hebrew is as an alphabet. He did it all in good fun, and he didn't dive into the history of why it is the way it is, but I will link it here in case you want to see it. I thought it was pretty good. The earliest texts that we have no punctuation, no commas, no exclamation marks, no end of verse markers, no chapter divisions. Sometimes even spaces between words was unclear. There were paragraph breaks, but these are often inconsistent between manuscripts. There was no standardized spelling. It was rather common for the same word to be used twice closely in the same text and use two different spellings. It happens so often it appears intentional, as though the scribe is showing us that only someone who is rather uncreative could spell a word only one way. As you can imagine, with a text as long as the Bible, there are places where it is unclear what word was intended, where sentences should end, and when the author has moved on to a new independent thought. Now, almost all modern Hebrew textbooks hide all of this from you. They present a clean, tidy system with well-defined rules. Any student who has gone beyond the exercises and engaged with the actual texts knows how quickly you stumble across places that don't seem to follow the rules. The truth is, language is messy, and ancient languages, with documents composed over many centuries by authors from different locations and backgrounds, is even more so. Then we need to talk about the tragedy of 586 BCE, the Babylonian captivity, where the population of Judah was dragged off to Babylon. A linguistic shift occurred. Much of the vocabulary of the First Temple period was lost. Hebrew started to be displaced as the common tongue. Aramaic, the lingua franca of the empire, began to take over. We can actually see the erosion of classical Hebrew within the pages of the Bible itself. Scholars call this late biblical Hebrew. I'll explain more on that in a little bit. By the late Second Temple period, The average person on the street couldn't really understand Hebrew of the Torah very well. They needed translators. This gave rise to the early Targum tradition, Aramaic translations given orally in the synagogue, as well as to the Septuagint, the Greek translation. So let's back up for a second here and talk about what grammar is and how we started to care about it. We need to distinguish between the two ways of looking at language, descriptive and prescriptive. Descriptive grammar just observes how people talk. Prescriptive grammar tells you how you should talk. When dealing with an ancient language that left behind no grammar books, all you can do is try to form a descriptive grammar to define what we most commonly see in the writing that they left behind. Only a current living community can try to write and enforce a prescriptive grammar. The ancient languages, it's not possible. They're dead. They don't care. The idea of a formalized grammar originated in Greek and Latin traditions starting in about the 3rd century BCE and would have been unknown to the Bible authors. Before that point, no one had ever thought to write down rules for how a language worked. This is part of why we lost so many ancient languages. Language was learned primarily by immersion, and while there certainly were stylistic rules, they were mainly enforced by wanting to be clearly understood, to sound like the educated class, or to sound like the really slick public orators and poets. These people were quite artistic in their formulation of language, and like all artists, they didn't always follow rules if they thought breaking them sounded better. And since there are no real rules anyway, everybody thought this was great. The grammar rules we use to analyze the Bible today didn't come from the Bible authors. They were developed starting in the 10th century Common Era by Jewish scholars attempting to describe what they were seeing in the text, composed well over 1,000 years earlier. We'll get to their story in a moment. First, we need to look at the actual subject of this video, the Hebrew verb. Well, okay, before we get into verbs, we actually need to take a little look at the correlating conjunction. It's the equivalent to the word and. In Hebrew, it is a single letter Vav. It looks like a straight line with a small hook on the top. Unlike English, it is not a separate word. It is a prefix that is attached to the front of the next word. And it is everywhere. It is far more common than any other conjunction. Translators hate this repetitive and. Apparently, that's bad English. So translators get creative. They translate the Vav as yet, but, or, then, or sometimes they just leave it out entirely. This obscures the original text. Okay, now knowing what a conjunction is, let's talk about the verb. Now, Hebrew has two major verb forms or inflections. The Hebrew verb generally has a 3-letter root that you conjugate or inflect by adding stuff to it. In one form, the verb is conjugated by adding suffixes to the verb. This suffix form was associated with the past tense. Remember, Hebrew goes right to left, and you should be looking at the red letters at the left end of the word. Those are the suffixes. The other major form of the verb was conjugated by adding a prefix and sometimes a suffix. Again, you should be looking at the right side of the word this time, although this form does also have additions to the left side as well in some of its forms, but its distinctive feature was adding to the beginning of the word. This form was associated with the future tense. In English, you were probably taught in grade school that you should pick a tense and write your entire document, or at least your entire paragraph, or certainly your whole sentence, in that one single tense. But in Hebrew, this is not the case at all. Good Hebrew, especially in narrative sections, starts with one verb tense, then flips to others for the following verbs. It doesn't take long before you run into this. Let's look at the very beginning. Let's look at Genesis 1:1. It says, Barashit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'et haaretz. In the beginning, we already have a nice time marker here to let us know that we're talking about something that's in the past. God created, bara, the heaven and the earth. That's the past tense or suffix form. That makes sense. But let's continue. We'll skip a bit down to verse 3. Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or. And he will say. We have switched tense. The verb here is a prefix future form. But it clearly happened in the past. Future tense makes no sense here. As we have argued about what is happening in this phenomenon over the last century, we've come up with plenty of names for what to call this. But the standard explanation is that the presence of a conjunction, the word and, flips the tense of the verb from future to past. Students, when they hear this, generally think you are pulling their leg. No language does that. It doesn't make sense. This is called the Vav Conversive. Not because you're using it in a conversation, but because it converts the verb. This was too confusing, so they came up with other terms like the Vav Reversive, the Vav Inversive, and taking a slightly different idea on what is happening, the Vav Consecutive. It gets better. It doesn't do it all the time. Sometimes the and is just an and. If the conjunction is going to flip the tense, we have an ah vowel. If it's just going to be the word and, then it will have a short e vowel that we call a schwa. You might already be remembering that there were no vowels when this was composed. Right. There is no way from the ancient written text to tell these apart. You're right. But wait, there's more. Let's make it a bit worse. What if you add the conjunction to a past tense verb? You guessed it. It flips to being a future tense verb. But this one's a bit different. There are not two different vowel sounds to tell you it's just a conjunction or if it flips the tense. It's all the same. You just get to choose. So, how do textbooks address this? Well, let's look at two of them. Introduction to Biblical Hebrew by Thomas Lambden, published in 1971, a famous scholar of the language, and his textbook is what I used in college. And also, we're going to look at a more modern Basics of Biblical Hebrew by Practico and Van Pelt. Certainly they are not of the same kind of credentials as Lambden, but they wrote a very concise and well-organized text that I quite like. The perfect is what we call the suffix form. Lambden gives several specific situations and basically says that the perfect verb can be a simple past tense or a present tense. In some cases in prose writing, it can have a habitual meaning, something that one does regularly. Lambden loves saying that things have habitual meaning. Practico and Van Pelt say it represents completed actions in the past, present, or future, but suggest that you just stick with the past until you learn how messed up all of this is. The imperfect is what we call the prefix form. Lambden gives three situations for the imperfect, starting with the future tense, but also adds that it can be habitual tense as well. Of course it can. And then also adds that it can be a modal tense expressing a conditional state, something that may or should happen. He also says it does not indicate completed action. Practico and Van Pelt say it represents incomplete action and can be past, present, or future. So these two systems do not agree. Lambden specifically rejects the whole idea of completed and incomplete actions. He waits until later in his book to explain why and when the tenses flip, but we have a system where basically any verb can flip from future to past and past to future, or not. And there is no way to tell, except in cases where the scribes added vowel markers 1,500 years after the text was composed. Everything I've explained so far about the verb is not actually what's happening. So let's take a look at how we got here and what we have learned. So I mentioned earlier that we can see Hebrew degrading in the later books of the Bible. Let's talk about that a bit. If you look at the post-exilic books, these are the ones written after the Babylonian captivity, like Esther, Kohelet, which is Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, the grammatical landscape has shifted dramatically. The rigid verb, subject, object, word order of Genesis begins to break down, often replaced by a subject verb order that mimics Aramaic. The vocabulary shrinks and changes. Less common ancient words are forgotten, replaced by Persian loanwords and Aramaic terms that would have sounded foreign to David or Isaiah. Most critical in our detective story, however, is the collapse of the verbal system. In the book of Chronicles, which retells the stories from Samuel and Kings, we can see scribes updating the grammar. Where 1 Kings 14:28 uses a classic Vav Consecutive, the parallel passage in 2 Chronicles 12:11 switches it to a simple perfect tense. The scribe seemingly felt that the old form was too archaic and replaced it with the modern equivalent. In Esther, the narrator starts using the participle, words like sitting or standing, not just to describe nouns, but to carry the main action of the story, something a classical scribe would never do. By the time we get to Ecclesiastes, the Vav Consecutive imperfect has virtually vanished, appearing only about 3 times in the entire book. Finally, in the books like Ezra and Daniel, the authors sometimes just give up on Hebrew entirely and switch over to Aramaic. While a large chunk of the knowledge about the language was lost when Jerusalem was destroyed by Babylon, by the time Jerusalem was destroyed again by the Romans, even more had been lost, and Aramaic was taking over as the primary language. Christians lost what interest they had in Hebrew very early on, and the language would become unknown to them until the Renaissance. If you want to learn more about that, I made a video about Johannes Reuchlin and how the knowledge of Hebrew exploded in the Renaissance. But even among Jews before the Renaissance, literacy was fairly low, and Hebrew knowledge was limited to a fairly small group of very educated people. So we have established these forms started to die out during the Babylonian captivity, to the point that they were rarely used and poorly understood by the end of the biblical era. So how did we come up with this understanding of flipping the tense of verbs? First, we have the Masoretes, roughly 6th to 10th centuries Common Era. They were deeply concerned with preserving information about the text that was known primarily only through oral tradition. They also realized these traditions of how exactly to read the text were starting to fragment and diverge. To correct this, they invented a set of vowel markers to add to the text. They also invented complicated accent markers, and even a few markers that we no longer remember what they were used for. Importantly, they also added end-of-verse markers. They also added extensive margin notes. Particularly important were places where they felt that the preserved text was incorrect, and they added notes about it in the margins of what it should read instead. This was a lengthy process, and there were vigorous disagreements on what the correct readings should be. In the end, they did manage to arrive with a standardized text we still use today from the end of the 10th century. At the end of the era of the Masoretes, we have 2 important figures. In the East, the intellectual giant of this period was Saadia Gaon, a scholar born in Egypt who rose to become the head of the great rabbinic academy in Sura, Babylonia. Living at the height of the Islamic Golden Age, Saadia was the first to systematically apply the rigorous logic of Arabic linguistics to the Hebrew language. In his pioneering work, Kutub al-Lugha, the Book of the Language, he argued that Hebrew grammar was not a collection of mystical irregularities, but a logical system that could be analyzed just like Arabic. Because Arabic was a similar grammatical structure to Hebrew, including its verb roots and tense systems, Saadia used it as a template to decode biblical syntax. However, Arabic had no equivalent to the strange tense-flipping behavior of Hebrew verbs. For this, Saadia was on his own. He was the first to articulate that the Hebrew verb system was essentially binary, past and future, and that the Vav prefix functioned as a mechanical converter between these 2 states. By translating the entire Bible into Arabic, the tafsir, he cemented this understanding, forcing ambiguous Hebrew forms into clear Arabic tenses and effectively canonizing the conversional theory for generations of Jews in the Islamic world. Meanwhile, in the West, the center of Jewish scholarship was shifting to Cordoba, Spain, where Menahem bin Saruk was working. Unlike Saadia, who wrote in Arabic, Menahem championed the purity of the Hebrew language and compiled the Masoretes, the first complete dictionary of biblical Hebrew written entirely in Hebrew. Although he staunchly opposed openly comparing Hebrew with foreign languages like Arabic, he was nonetheless deeply influenced by the Arabic grammatical environment in Spain. In his effort to categorize every word in the Bible, he had to account for the strange behavior of verbs in the narrative texts. By organizing the Hebrew lexicon according to roots and systematizing the rules of their conjugation, he helped formalize the idea that these flipped tenses were not errors but standard rules of the holy tongue. His work provided the essential reference material that subsequent European scholars would rely on, ensuring that the theory of the Vav Conversive became the standard teaching in Jewish schools and Christian Europe as well when they learned Hebrew. This was the accepted view for almost 1,000 years. Why did nobody challenge it? Why did it change? The cracks in the linguistic theories began to form in the 19th century. To this point, Arabic was the only Semitic language scholars could turn to, which, while it is a cousin language, it isn't that close to Hebrew. In the 1850s, the holy grail of philology was decoding Akkadian cuneiform. Three remarkable scholars arose that became famous for their work on cuneiform: Edward Hincks, Henry Rawlinson, and Jules Oppert. But skeptics believed that these scholars were simply inventing meanings for these strange-looking abstract wedges. To settle the matter, the Royal Asiatic Society in London devised a definitive test in 1857. They provided a newly discovered inscription of the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser I to our three holy trinity of cuneiform scholars, as well as to William Talbot, who was the one who proposed this test. Working independently, the four men submitted their translations in sealed envelopes. When the jury unsealed them, the similarities were undeniable. Akkadian had been deciphered, revealing a Semitic language far older than the Hebrew Bible and much closer to, and likely a direct ancestor of, Hebrew. Building on this foundation, a self-taught working-class genius named George Smith made another significant development. A former banknote engraver with no university education, Smith had taught himself to read cuneiform during his lunch breaks at the British Museum. In 1872, while sorting through heaps of broken clay tablets from Nineveh, he stumbled upon a tablet describing a ship grounded on a mountain and a bird sent out to find land. Realizing he had found an independent account of the Great Flood, Smith reportedly was so overcome with excitement, he began to run around the room and tear off his clothes. I guess you had to be there. On December 3rd, 1872, he presented his translation of the Flood Tablet, which was part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, to the Society of Biblical Archaeology. The audience was stunned to learn that the flood narrative existed for centuries before the writings of Genesis, forcing a complete reevaluation of the biblical text's history. Suddenly we had a Semitic language, Akkadian, and it was much older than the Bible, but grammatically connected to Hebrew. Obviously, there was a closely connected cultural and literary tradition as well. A bit later, in 1887, the Amarna letters were discovered, correspondence from Canaanite kings to Egypt, written in Akkadian, but full of Canaanisms that looked a lot like Hebrew. Now we have even more text to draw on to understand how Hebrew developed. This brings us to the second era. Scholars began to realize that past and future were Western concepts, and they proposed a new idea, aspects. The revolt against the conversive theory began with the German Orientalist Heinrich Ewald. He argued that for centuries grammarians had been committing a fundamental category error. They were forcing Semitic thought into the Indo-European grammar. Ewald proposed that the ancient Hebrew mind did not obsess over when an action happened, time, but rather the state of the action, aspect. He stripped away the labels of past and future and renamed them perfect, meaning a completed action, and imperfect, meaning an incomplete or ongoing action. Regarding the mysterious Vav, Ewald argued it wasn't a magic time machine that flipped tense, rather it was a logical connector indicating consequence. In his view, the Vav linked the action so tightly to the one before it that it adopted the flow of the narrative, marking the logical result of a sequence rather than a jump in time. It was not a Vav Conversive, but a Vav Consecutive. The theory of Ewald was refined and championed for the English-speaking world by the Oxford giant S.R. Driver in his landmark 1892 work, A Treatise on the Use of Tenses in Hebrew. You may recognize his name as part of the Brown-Driver-Briggs lexicon. Driver took Ewald's aspectual theory and added more layers of psychological depth to it. He argued that Hebrew speakers viewed the world through relative rather than absolute time. When a narrator used the Vav consecutive, Driver argued they weren't applying a grammatical rule so much as expressing a vivid imagination. The speaker was mentally rushing forward to the result, viewing the next event as the inevitable, immediate consequence of the first. By seeing the consequence as immediate, the speaker treated it as a done deal, complete and perfect, even if technically it was a future form. While Driver's aspect theory was a brilliant step away from the rigidity of Latin grammar, it relied heavily on speculating about the psychology of ancient Hebrews in rather novel ways, rather than on any hard linguistic evidence. This is the basic theory that we saw in Practico and von Pelt's grammar, and while it is now rejected by most linguists, it still has its advocates, and it is present in many grammar books. There are a lot of problems with this theory, including numerous examples where the ideas of complete and incomplete action are obviously not correct, as well as many passages where the verb is not following another verb in a consecutive action. The Third Era. Early in the 20th century, the pendulum swings again. Scholars like Hans Bauer in 1912 and G. Bergstrasser in 1918 looked at comparative languages and said, it's not aspects either, it's history. To understand their argument, we have to look under the hood of Semitic languages at a mechanism called apocope, a fancy linguistic term for chopping off the end of a word. Bauer and Bergstrasser reconstructed a Proto-Semitic ancestor language that had two different prefix verbs, distinguished only by a final vowel. First, there is the long form, pronounced yaktulu. Notice the final u marked the verb as indicative, meaning real, ongoing, or future action. It means he kills, or he will kill. Second, there is a short form pronounced yaktul. Notice there is no vowel at the end. This was the preterite, the standard way to say he killed in simple past. In the ancient world, the difference between he will kill and he killed was entirely carried by that final vowel. But then, the Hebrew language evolved. The short vowels began to drop off. The u in the future tense vanished. The result was a collision. The long form, yaktulu, became yiktol. The short form, yaktul, also became yiktol. Suddenly the language had two completely different tenses that sounded exactly the same. Evidence for this can be seen in the jussive forms as well as in the tendency to double the first letter after the conjugation, according to these scholars. You will need to read the papers to get all of those details. So Bergstrasser argued that when we see the Vav consecutive imperfect in the Bible, we aren't seeing a future verb and that the and magically flipped it to the past. We are seeing a genuine archaic past tense verb. One of the evidences they use to support this is in particularly ancient texts like the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15. This past tense prefix form shows up without a converting conjunction, showing it was part of the language in early Hebrew, but only was preserved in later Hebrew when it was attached with a conjunction. Then came 1929. A plowman in Syria hit a stone, leading to the discovery of the ancient city of Ugarit. we found thousands of tablets in an alphabetic language that was quickly decoded. It was even closer to Hebrew than Akkadian. It was older than the Israelite entry into Canaan. Ugaritic taught us a massive amount about the religion of the Canaanites, but grammatically it was a goldmine. It confirmed that this short past verb existed in a normal narrative tense in neighboring languages without any magic converting and. Armed with Ugaritic and the Amarna letters, scholars in the mid-20th century refined the theory, taking us to the Fourth Era. They realized the converted imperfect, the and plus future equals past, and the converted perfect, the and plus past equals future, actually have two different origins. They are not the same rule working in two different directions. William L. Moran, working on the Amarna letters in the 1950s and 60s, showed that the converted perfect likely evolved from conditional sentences. In the ancient world, you would say, if the king commands, then it is done. You use a past or perfect verb to show a future certainty. The Hebrew and acted like our word then. This fits with the description we saw from Lambden in his grammar. Meanwhile, in the mid-20th century, the American scholar Cyrus Gordon discovered the final piece of the puzzle. Ugaritic preserved an older state of the Semitic verb system. Gordon analyzed the narrative poetry of the Baal cycle and discovered the Ugaritic scribes used the exact same short prefix form, yaktul, to tell stories about the past that Hebrew did using what had been assumed to be a future tense verb. The smoking gun, however, was that the conjunction, in Hebrew this form was always attached to the word and, leading to the belief that the and was what converted the tense, but Gordon showed that in Ugaritic poetry, this verb appeared consistently without the and proved definitively that the pastness was built into the verb itself, not the conjunction. It matched up with the previous work from Bergstrasser that saw this behavior in Exodus 15. Hebrew hadn't invented a magic converting and, it had simply shortened an ancient Semitic narrative past tense so that it looked the same as a future tense, and used the and as a stylistic habit. Then the greatest discovery of all. It starts with a shepherd boy throwing a rock and changing the world, and he didn't even have to kill a giant to do it. This boy heard a jar break inside the cave where he had thrown his rock, and the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. The Dead Sea Scrolls give us a library of Hebrew texts from 1,000 years after Moses, but also 1,000 years before our oldest copies of the Bible. This brings us to the Fifth Era. Our modern scholars, Mark S. Smith and John A. Cook, who wrote the papers that most of this information is pulled from. Mark S. Smith analyzed the scrolls and found something fascinating. In texts like the War Scroll, the authors tried to imitate biblical language. They used the Vav consecutive constantly. But, and this is the key, they made errors. They used it in ways that didn't quite fit the classical patterns. However, other scrolls that were more legal texts or letters, such as 4QMMT, the Manual of Discipline, or the Communal Rule document, they never used the Vav consecutive. This suggests that by the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Vav consecutive was dead as a spoken language. It was a high literary style kept alive by scribes who wanted to sound biblical, much like we might use thou and thee in our prayers today, even if we don't really understand the rules of how those words work. Cook takes this further and argues that we need to stop teaching students the conversion rule because it confuses them and this isn't what's actually happening. We should just call them what they are, a narrative past tense used for storytelling and an irreal perfect used for future or modal logic conditions. So where does that leave us? First, all linguistic reconstructions must remain tentative. We are detectives working with fragmented evidence. The early grammatical rules applied to the Bible were unknown to the biblical authors, and so are these newer reconstructions. New discoveries may happen, and I hope they do. Second, be very skeptical of textbooks that tell you the classical explanation that the conjunction and magically flips the tense. This is a 1,000-year-old theory that doesn't hold up to modern archaeology and linguistics. Also, treat with some skepticism any explanation about incomplete or complete aspects. This was incredibly popular at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, but it was based on very little evidence and has not held up well. Third, understand that there are legitimate reasons why translators disagree on tense. There is no clear correct answer because the language itself was evolving while the Bible was being written, and even with our better understanding, we are still left with no precisely clear way to tell which tense was intended by the author in many cases. And finally, if this discussion hasn't been adequately deep and technical for you, I refer you to the 2 excellent papers by Cook and Smith that take up the subject much further than we can possibly do in this video. Well, that's all for today. Please hit the like and subscribe button and hit the bell so that you won't miss out on future exciting videos like this where I discuss even more grammar and maybe some other interesting stuff, and where we explore more of the beauty of the Hebrew Bible.